here with you.
Perfect. Okay, good. Alrighty. Well, thanks everyone. I'm really looking forward to spending some time with you all and sharing some digital space. Um, my name is Hunter Cardinal, and I'm the director of Story and half of the sibling team behind Naheowin, a storytelling and education company that I started with my sister. My background is in acting and performance, and my main passion in life is connecting people with the larger, very exciting stories that they're a part of so that they can feel turbulent times, kind of like the ones we're in right now. Just a bit of background before we dive into things on Naheowin and who we are and what we do. So we're a social enterprise that offers sustainable, practical, and Indigenous-based solutions for the improvement of diversity and inclusion in businesses and organizations across Turtle Island. The way that we do this is through a storytelling and educational approach that's informed by our treaty lens. So how do we approach, nurture, and maintain relationships through an Indigenous perspective? Now, before we get into the meat of the presentation, I wanted to just say that what you're going to be hearing is just the tip of the iceberg of what exists about how Indigenous peoples, how we navigate and experience our past, present, and future. So what you're going to be hearing is not exhaustive, and I couldn't include everything even if I tried. But another thing on that note as well is that I am Naheowak, or a Cree person. And because of that, I'm going to be drawing on examples from my own culture to illustrate certain concepts, but I have tried to include other perspectives as well from other traditions and histories. And we're going to be sharing this information to you all digitally, but please feel free to say hello or ask any questions in the chat window. If there's anything that I can speak to, I would love an opportunity to do that. And before we really get into things, I wanted to put in place a policy for good relations. So this is something that my sister and we typically want to put in place for our workshops or any work that we're doing, and that is our tatawau policy. Now, what this word means, tatawau, in Cree, it's typically used to say welcome. But what it really means is there is room. So what I hope that you feel throughout our time together is that there is room for you with all the information that you have or may not have about Indigenous worldviews or histories or some of the Indigenous roots of hockey. There's room for you to ask questions, to make assumptions, and definitely to make a mistake. And that is because we are all on this journey together of learning. And what I love about this teaching of tatawau is it's not something that just relies on me to provide to you all, which I'm going to do. But what it does do is it's almost like a call to action. So if we're seeing some comments in the chat window or we're going through this content ourselves for the first time, that we really make sure that we're bringing that space, that welcoming feeling throughout that. So it's something that we can extend to ourselves. And then we have a really like self-enforcing bubble of feeling welcome throughout our time. So I just wanted to put that in there. Now, you're all here to think about this big question, and I imagine that this is what a lot of sessions that you just attended were focusing on, which is thinking about this big question. So how can we end racism in hockey? The racial discrimination that we're hearing more and more about, and that we're learning has been a part of this game for quite some time. So I really understand the daunting feeling that one may have when looking at a question like this, because it's really big. And also the work that we need to do in order to solve this is huge. And I can say this because I get it. This is the real work that is facing our generation. Big questions like these are what my sister and I work on in our company, Naheowin. So the way that we do all of our work is by trying to reapproach the questions that we're being asked to solve by using language and storytelling. And more specifically, because Indigenous peoples are a very diverse group of cultures, the Naheowin language of my ancestors, the Naheowak. And some of you might even recognize us by the name given to us by the French, which is Cree. So the reason we do this, why we use language and storytelling to really approach these questions, is because we know that language shapes the way in which we see the world around us. So I wanted to give you two examples of this. The first example is in the Russian language. So in the Russian language, there are two different words to describe or refer to what we in English might call two different shades of blue. There is light blue, which is goloboy, and dark blue, which is sini. Now, because of this, Russian speakers are better able to tell the difference between a light and dark blue. I found that to be pretty practical and pretty interesting. But we can look at other examples as well of how language has drastically affected the ways in which Indigenous peoples kind of look at the world. So for the Cook Taor people, who are an Indigenous people in Australia, they don't use words like left or right. Everything in their language is referred to as north, south, east, and west. So in their language, they would say things like, oh, there's an ant on your southwest leg, or move that log on the fire to the north-northeast. Now, because of this and why it's important, is the Cook Taor people are amazing navigators and have redefined for scientists just how well human beings can keep their bearings. And I find that to be mind-blowing and super cool. So the question then becomes, what can language do to help us with solving bigger problems? So let me show you with just a quick example that's known as the mutilated checkerboard problem. So this is from a famous psychology experiment from Max Black's book, Critical Thinking, and this was released back in the 1940s. So what you're looking at right now is you have a checkerboard that has 8 by 8 squares, so a total of 64 squares. Now, if I gave you 32 dominoes, which you could see just to the right, that could cover both a perfect horizontal and vertical square. The question is, do you think you can cover the entire board? And obviously the answer is yeah, the math checks out. We can totally do that. And it's an easy question. But what if I cut off the upper right and bottom left squares and gave you 31 dominoes and asked you if you could cover the entire board once again? So this doesn't seem like a very hard question, but let's just think about it for a second, because it actually is. So if we were to start at the bottom left, it would make sense that what we would do is we would essentially just slide those dominoes over one row. And if we were to lay it horizontally, we can see there's two pairs that we could cover at the bottom, most left. And then we can continue laying them down. And once we get to the bottom corner, it's going to make sense that we're going to need to have the domino go vertically. And then we can continue kind of going at that pattern, snaking up the board until we get to the second topmost row of dominoes. Now, at this point, we can try a bunch of different things, but we're always going to have one domino that's kind of just hanging over the edge there. So we're not actually able to perfectly cover this board. So we could say okay, well, that was our first try. Let's try something else. And we could try vertically. Now, we could basically just do the same thing, but we'll end up with the same conclusion of having always a dangling domino, and we're not able to do it. Now, we could say, well, that was a dumb pattern hunter. Why don't we try to do something different? And we could spend our time doing a lot of different complex geometric shapes and patterns and spend a lot of time. But what if I said, hey, imagine that these white squares that you're seeing, let's just consider them as not white squares, but salt. And then let's look at these black squares and say, what if they're not black squares, they're pepper? What some of you may have all of a sudden realized is that I've removed 2 of the salt squares. So I've removed 2 of the same colored squares on this checkerboard, which means that no matter what you do, this question is absolutely impossible to solve because you do not have the same number of white and black squares. So it is impossible. Now, how we were able to get there very quickly was by changing the language that we were using, going from white squares to black squares to essentially salt and pepper. And with that, we changed the story that we're telling. So with big problems like the presence of racial discrimination in hockey, and perhaps how we can create a more inclusive game, perhaps we need a new way of looking at things. Perhaps we need a new or different story. So to begin with finding that story, what I wanted to do is go back to the origins of hockey. And in order to really understand its significance to the Indigenous origins that it does have at one part of its history, we'll have to understand how Indigenous peoples look at the world. Now, this is really important because we often forget that there is a gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous worldviews. So for example, we might be using the same words like sports, but meaning something entirely different. So what I wanted to do is begin with exploring what Indigenous worldviews are, in what ways they matter, and how these worldviews formed the basis for relationships between Indigenous peoples and also non-Indigenous peoples. So we'll start with the land because that's typically the best place to start. Indigenous peoples have resided on Turtle Island for as long as we can remember. And in fact, our connection to this place is so deep that we're specifically using the word indigenous because it comes from the Latin word indigena, meaning sprung from the land. So you can see that there is that connection to that idea of being connected to the earth in a very profound way. Now, this connection to land is foundational to understanding the complex and dynamic relationality that underpins the worldviews of Indigenous peoples. So it affects how we move through the world, it affects how we see the world, and how we think about problems or solutions. So a really great example that I wanted to bring is the first sacred teaching that is for my ancestors or the Cree people. And that sacred teaching is Sagittar, which means love one another. Now this was inspired from directly how we understood how the earth showed its love by allowing things to sprout or grow on it. Now we can also see how this has impacted the language as well. So it is thought that language also comes from the land, and that when you're speaking an Indigenous language from the place where it comes from, you're actively taking part in singing the song of the world. So I find that fascinating because, not only can we really see that, yes, we are connected to the land in a very logical way of the food that we eat comes from the land, and then the food then becomes a part of us. But it's shaping the way in which we see the land and understand our relationship to the land. So it's totally different. It's far more deep. And then also there's a connectedness from how we then formulate the words and articulate ideas that come from the land. And we can really see that these languages on Turtle Island or North America are absolutely so diverse. And that's because these languages are springing from different ecological areas within North America. And that's why we can say that a lot of these languages are as different as comparing German to Cantonese, but also as similar as comparing Italian to Spanish. Now, in addition to this diversity of languages, we also have a diversity of ways in which they're communicated. So it's a myth that Indigenous languages don't have written forms of their language. Many do. And a really great example, and one that's pertinent to me, is the Nehiwewen or Cree language syllabics. And right there's a picture in Edmonton of the Indigenous Art Park. And there is a word there that's spelling basically the word for fire. And what you're reading is the word tail. So it's really fascinating. Now that's what one word looks like. But I wanted to write it out in full so that you can see what the writing system looks like when it's completely laid out. So this is the Nehiwewen syllabic completely written out. It's known as a star chart. Now what you're looking at are 48 symbols that are used to communicate the sounds of our language. So it's very similar to English, except when you compare the alphabets, they're a bit different. With English, we would kind of combine different letters and vowels and consonants and whatnot to form certain sounds, which would then be a syllabic or a syllable. It would make one sound. But with the Cree writing system, each of these symbols is a sound. So if you can read the Cree syllabic system, you can actually speak Cree, which I find to be really fascinating. And really, when you're learning it as well, what I love about this is that traditionally, in a very ceremonial context, you would always write it out in a particular way. So you would always write it out on the ground with one of the symbols, which if you look to the left of the screen, there is a small triangle that is pointing to the left on the inmost ring. That one is right here. That is the first symbol that you would write, and it's the sound ah. And then you would write it so it's always facing towards the east. So right there you have a reminder in this writing system that we are connected to the land, that we need to be remembering that when we're writing it out fully, and then also making sure that we have other relations that we need to keep in mind as well, which is to the stars and the directions. So I find that to be really interesting because we're seeing that this syllabic writing system is not just something that helps us communicate sounds, but is a device for teaching as well. Now, these symbols don't represent just sounds. They also represent teachings. And this symbol here, the first symbol and also the first teaching, is connected to that teaching that I shared a little earlier, which is Sagittar. So as I said before, this is the first sacred teaching of to love one another. Now, when I was first learning this from a knowledge keeper named Reuben Quinn, he said, this is the first symbol that we write, and the reason why it's the first symbol that we write is because it's also our first sacred law, and it's something that we should be keeping in the hearts of who we are as Nehiyaw or Nehiyawak, which is Cree people, and it should always be guiding that, and it means love one another. And I was like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. Of course we should be doing that. And I thought about it. I was like, yeah, I should not only love myself, but make sure that I'm loving everyone and everything around me, and I should be extending that. And that made sense. But later, when he was really trying to make sure that I understood its significance, because once again, there's a difference in Indigenous worldviews, especially in language, he asked me, Hunter, what do you think the root word, or why this word means what it is? What is that root word of Sagittar? And I thought about it for a second, and I was like, okay, well, if it means love one another, obviously I think that Sagittar means love, like the root word of it is love. And he kind of smiled and he shook his head. And he said, no, that's actually not what it is. It's Sagik, which means to sprout or to grow. And in that moment, I saw exactly what my ancestors saw when they're thinking about that concept of loving one another. It is a process that is very similar to what we see in nature. It is that non-linear, that messy, circular process of allowing things to grow or change. And that we are, as people, going through that process ourselves. Our relationships are going through that process. So we should be making sure that we provide people that metaphoric space to continue to grow or to continue to change. And I was like, that makes so much sense because that's entirely what love is. That's what a good partnership is. That's what good friendships are. And that's what good parent relationships are as well. So I thought that that was a really interesting way to demonstrate an Indigenous worldview that is directly impacted from the ways in which my ancestors saw the world and how it showed its love for the things that grow on it. It makes space for them to grow. It makes space for them to change. So because Indigenous peoples understand all things and beings as being directly connected to the land, that it is a primary relationship that we all share, it makes sense that we then understand ourselves as being connected to each other. So everyone, because of their shared relationship to the world, is in a way sort of like siblings, because the earth is our mother. And I'm sure that some of you have kind of heard that idea of Mother Earth, and Indigenous peoples often referring to each other in terms of kinships, as everyone is someone's auntie or uncle or brother or sister. So this belief really, once again, influenced the creation of many complex and varied governance models, many of which include a strong but also spiritual element to their core. So once again, it is that idea that we are not only connected to each other because of our connection to the earth, but we are all connected to not only the earth, but the world on the other side, that spirit world. And a really great tool to kind of illustrate what could come from an Indigenous worldview would be a very powerful ways in which we can sort of look at decision making, or how do we facilitate as a community developing a greater understanding of a problem or a tool or an idea. So this is the concept of the circle. And it was best explained to me from an elder who said that if we were to gather around a tree to really understand what this tree looks like, it would make sense that, from my place in the circle, I would be describing what I see. And I would say, oh, I see a very beautiful green tree. The leaves are really really happy. This looks like a really healthy tree. I see some healthy bark as well. It reminds me of springtime, and no, actually it reminds me of summertime. And oh my gosh, and just in the top right corner, I can see just peeking through the branches a little bird's nest with tiny little birds flapping around. And I'm like, this is a very healthy tree. And that's what I see. Now, the person beside me, it would make sense that they would say oh, I see the same thing too. And we would agree that that makes sense because we sit very close together. So it would make sense that we would share that perspective because we are close together in that greater circle that we're a part of. And if we were to continue this process of sharing what we see honestly from the tree in the center, it would make sense that if we go around to the other side of the circle that's directly opposite from me, to perhaps where you might be sitting, you could say, I actually don't see a tree at all. I see something that I see like a big gash in the bark. I see that it looks like there's some sort of fire here. There's a scorched bark, and the trees are starting to turn yellow. And I don't see that there is a bird's nest at all. I can't even hear it. So what's really important is in that moment, these two ideas, because they are different, does not necessarily mean that they are in conflict, but rather it all makes sense that they are in relationship because they're seeing just a different aspect of the tree. They're seeing another side. And what we need to do in that moment is we need to both trust and really listen to each other that what we're doing is building a greater understanding. And if we are to continue that process of really hearing and listening to what people are saying and then trusting what they're saying, by the end of us going around in the circle, what we've done is we've created a really multi-dimensional understanding of whatever it is that is in the center of this circle. So I find that that is a really great demonstration of just a different way of thinking about things. And for me, it really gets at this point of things, there's room for there to be multiple perspectives on whatever it is we're exploring. So I'm just going to hold here, and I'm going to ask you all, just from the chat, any questions so far, anything resonating? I know that sometimes this can be new, sometimes it's not new. So I'll just hold some space right now for there to be any questions or comments in the chat. Great, we're good to go. So we just talked about for a little bit of how communities kind of nurtured themselves within a community. But a really great place that I want to explore is how did relationships form and how are they nurtured between communities, so larger groups of people, different cultures. So to facilitate peaceful coexistence between different cultures, many different processes of treaty making developed over time. And when I say treaty, some images of Western treaties may come into people's minds. So treaties of Westphalia or Treaty of Versailles, if you are into history like I am, those are all treaties that typically are described by sort of being a written document. They are typically done post-conflict. And what they do is they kind of set up a relationship that is very much after conflict. And there is a clear winner and a clear loser. And there is the separation of sort of the goods or sort of the spoils from that conflict. And that's something that is typically a very fixed legal document. And the most important part of that relationship is the signed document and what is written on that document. So when I'm talking about treaties, I'm actually not talking about those treaties at all. I'm talking about the indigenous understandings of what treaties were, which are entirely different. And as you can see, they're coming from a completely different worldview. So these treaties that I'm talking about are the indigenous understandings of treaties. And they are processes that are rooted in kinship. So this idea of how can we create a relationship based off of making a connection so that we become family in a way, that we have a shared connection or relationship that could either be through a shared history, it could be through shared values, or being in the same environment. How can we, once again, not be strangers, but how can we see ourselves and the other person as family? One way that Indigenous treaties have been explained to me, which really helps, is it's a dynamic process by which you turn a group of other people from a they or an other into a we. That blew my mind, but it's totally true. And with this, these treaties are typically done to prevent conflict. So they are done before conflict, which is totally different from Western treaties. And with this, there are also ongoing processes that require different things in place to help renew this agreement, to help celebrate who is in this agreement, and also to remind us of what this agreement was in the first place. So a really great example that I love that really illustrates this Indigenous understanding treaty is the dish with one spoon wampum. And what a wampum is, before I get into it, is a wampum belt is, a wampum, that word is from the Narragansett people on the eastern seaboard of the United States. And a wampum is a string of white shells. That's what that word means. And you can see where we get that from, because just to the right is that dish with one spoon wampum. Now, these shells typically come in two colors. White shell, which is used to signify peace, coexistence, time, all good things in life. And it's also used in addition to a darker blue or a darker purpled shell. It is used to kind of create certain symbols or images that can convey certain meanings. So this wampum belt is sort of a physical device that would be used to metaphorically represent either a story or an agreement by which it can guide sort of a relationship between two peoples. So it's literally weaving together certain ideas that people can then see, remember the story, and therefore align themselves with whatever agreement they need to have in order to create some sort of peaceful coexistence or some sort of understanding. So this dish with one spoon wampum belt was made between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe in what is now known today as the Toronto area. And this is a very old agreement. So this was made in 1142 CE. So almost 900 years ago. It's a very long time ago. And I get really excited about this story because it's so simple. And basically what happened is, once again, like classic Indigenous treaties, to avoid conflict, these two nations, the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, came together because what they noticed is that, we're sharing the same territory. That means we're sharing the same resources. And if things get scarce, the first thing to go out the window will be our relationship. So what can we do? What is the story we need to have at the core of who we are? What are the values that we need to have guiding our actions so that we don't end in conflict? Because that's not good for anyone. So they thought and they thought and they thought, and what they came up with is a really elegant tool, a really simple story and a simple idea that's woven into this image of a dish with one spoon. So what they thought was that, okay, so we're coexisting in this area. So let's say that all of the plants, the animals, and the people that are in this area are thought to exist within this bowl. So that is sort of the area and who's involved in this situation. Now the question is, how are we going to interact with each other and the things in that bowl? So that's where we get the idea of the spoon. Now there's two really beautiful metaphors that are in this idea of the spoon. One is you get an immediate sense of a very important value to the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, which is one of sharing. Because it's not two spoons. That's what I originally thought. I was like, wouldn't it be the dish with two spoons? Like, we're going to share what's in the dish. It's like, no. Our conduct will be one that's based off of sharing. So we're only going to have one spoon. And that's going to be very mindful to us. And in addition to that, it's going to be a spoon, which means that we are going to make sure that we have very peaceful intentions or interactions when we are kind of interacting with this environment, interacting with this bowl. And I was like, wow, that's a lot of information that's kind of like right off the top when we start examining this. And also we can look at the large amount of white shells and we can say, you know what, it makes sense that visually the main idea of this belt is to have coexistence, because that's what white shells typically signify. So a couple other things that I wanted to highlight with this belt is that there are three ideas that are kind of the main driving points of this wampum belt. The first one is that we should only take what we need from this dish. So, and that makes sense. Now, the second idea is that we need to leave stuff behind for someone or something else. So what I love about that is it gets at this idea that we as people are not the only things in existence, that we need to be mindful of not only our human relationships, so it's not just between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, but it includes other non-human relationships, that we should be leaving something behind for the plants and the animals, and that we shouldn't be taking more than we need. And it kind of situates us in that larger metaphoric circle of life, which we're not in the center of. We are just a part of it, and we need to be mindful of that. And then the third idea is that we need to keep this place or this bowl clean. And what we can see once again is there are a lot of stories woven into this metaphoric device, and which would usually be accompanied with stories, songs, ceremonies, and celebrations that would help align everyone with what this intention is behind this agreement. I know for me, a lot of elders that I've spoken to, I think one actually said it as bluntly as this. It's like, human beings have horrible memories. You know, that's why we have ceremonies. That's why we have songs. They help us they remind us of certain things. So I really find that, once again, this is an entirely different understanding of relationships that is totally different from perhaps a non-Indigenous perspective of what relationships or treaties are and what's needed for them. So here on Treaty 6 territory, we can see very similar ideas reflected in the Cree understanding of treaty. So ideas of being in process, of relationship is a process that will require us to be doing something. And that spirit and intent of the numbered treaties, which is of living in peace, friendship, and understanding, is That's what it was understood from this Indigenous perspective of basically walking together in a good way, of having that coexistence, of we will be unique in our own identities as people, and so will you, and we'll make sure that we celebrate that and that we nurture that in one another. Now, for our people, our word in Nehiyawewin, or the Cree language for treaty, is Nistotamuin. And that is often translated as meaning understanding, or to make an understanding. But understanding has the etymology of Old English, which is the word understanding, which is just to comprehend or grasp the idea of, or quite literally to stand in the midst of, which is actually just a sliver of Nistotamuin's full meaning from the intention of the Cree language speakers and what we're actually trying to communicate. So let's look into this word for its morphemes, or the smallest linguistic units of a word, which can't be meaningfully broken down any further. So we'll start at the very end. What we have is win, which is the act of. And this is a process by which you turn a noun or something like that, or an action into a verb. And it's like an ongoing process. And this is very common in the Cree language because the Cree language is verb-based. It is not noun-based as opposed to English. Next, we have tamo, referring to direction or intentionality. So we have, it's a verb and it's referring to intentionality. And then lastly, we have nist. For those of you, if you're learning Cree or know some Cree, it may have been one of the first couple of words that you have learned, because this is the number 3 in Cree. Now, this is really confusing for me because I was like, why is this super random number in the word for understanding, which is a very important word because it's used to represent our treaties? Like, I was first like, shouldn't it be to match the parties in the treaty, or even one to mirror the two groups coming together to become one? And I had to ask elders to do some research and discovered that 3 refers to the 3 parts that constitute understanding between peoples, and then the order that they should be done in. And I was like, whoa, okay, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because that's totally different. So what those levels of understanding and the order that they should be understood in is, first, it's understanding and learning that we are all connected. Once again, you can see that that's a very common idea in Indigenous worldviews, that there's no true separation between yourself and anyone else, that we live essentially in an interconnected web of all things. So that is the first level. The second is learning about ourselves, that journey inward, knowing that key to properly understanding yourself is understanding your own specific place in this interconnected web. So it's really an inward journey of reflecting, who are you? What are the values that guide you? What do you want in life? And then the third is about learning about the other. So this is that very difficult process of attempting to grasp the full complexity of reality, that there are other beings, other people who are unique, who are whole and separate, but also connected to you. And this, of course, is very important because if they are like you, then they are also sovereign and growing in their own way. So those are those 3 ideas that are present in Nistotamuin. And with this understanding, we can see that Nistotamuin doesn't just translate into understanding. It translates more accurately into the intentional act of relationshiping. That's what we're trying to communicate from the Cree language, and we can see why that would make sense and why it's kind of the foundation to Indigenous worldviews. So now that we understand that about we as Indigenous peoples are always trying to use certain ideas as tools to bring us back into balance, bring us back into understanding our relationship to all things, now I think it's a really great opportunity to dive into the origins of hockey and seeing what we can kind of glean from this new understanding that we have about Indigenous peoples, understanding what hockey is, but also what sports are on a more broad sense. So before we do that, though, I just wanted to make, are there any questions based off of everything that I just shared? So if you have any questions, what you can do is you can type it in the chat. I'll leave some space right now. No pressure once again. All right, looks like there's no questions. So that's great. If you do have any questions, once again, feel free to type them in at any point. I really do welcome them. So the earliest Indigenous roots of hockey was a game that was called Duarkin that was played by the Mi'kmaq people. And just who were the Mi'kmaq? They were an Indigenous people of the northeastern woodlands in today's Atlantic provinces. Now, what you'll see to the right is an early map of that area that was made by Samuel du Champlain in 1612. I thought that was really interesting because you can kind of get a sense of just how new this area of the world was. And yeah, so this game of Duarkin was played by hitting a round stone on the ice with a stick, and it was most likely what some archaeologists are saying was a spruce root. So this stone ball was hit by what was called a striker, causing that round stone to roll along the ice and then be chased down by other players. Now, the other players tried to interfere with the stone carrier and take it from them before the stone was returned to the striker. Now, the player who returned it safely was then permitted to hit the ball next. So this game is like very old, and from what I was researching, that game and the teachings are embedded in that, and it's known by specific people. And I just find it really fascinating to be like, oh, that totally tracks to what I see when I look at the game today. Now, what we also see, which I find really fascinating, is that the Mi'kmaq wood carvers were associated with the making of early hockey sticks, and they had a hand in helping design that very unique shape that we're all familiar with. So this is, of course, a cutout from a catalog in the early 1900s. And this basically illustrates that the Mi'kmaq were master carvers. And by the turn of the 20th century, they're actually making hockey sticks and then shipping them worldwide. So there are some records from Indian agents around like 1909 and 1910 that claim that the Mi'kmaq, specifically from the Colchester district, made 1,000 dozen sticks, which is 12,000 sticks today. So I find that to be fascinating because it wasn't just like they made a couple of sticks, but there was actually a huge influence that the Mi'kmaq had in terms of hockey. Now, today, there are certain hockey historians that are starting to recover and acquire these sticks, some of which are way older than this, that actually predate the NHL and go back very, 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 very far. So when I was doing some research with this, a lot of the Mi'kmaq scholars and knowledge keepers kept on returning to this very important point, that the making of these sticks and also the playing of this game was medicine. It was described as medicine for their people, that it really brought them into balance. And this really highlights once again that yes, this was a game that was played, but it is also so holistic in terms of its nature, and how the Mi'kmaq really saw it, and saw it not just being a game, but something much more important. So through cultural exchange, the game of Duarkin did evolve. And what I really wanted to highlight at this part of our time together is that the origin of hockey is one that is absolutely non-linear. And I think that we can get down a really like non-productive path of trying to determine its singular origin. And I found that a hockey historian, David Carter, says something that really speaks to that and provides us a different way of looking at this. He says that I think the spirit of the game comes from various threads, and the Mi'kmaq are certainly a part of that tradition. So I think that that's really helpful in terms of understanding that there are multiple threads, but it also kind of gives us an idea of hockey is a game that was created through the weaving of those distinct threads together. And just a couple of those other threads of hockey include, but definitely aren't limited to, hurley, shinty, and also this other game that was indigenous called Achamadijik. And that was also from the Mi'kmaq people, and that's the Mi'kmaq language there. And then there are a bunch of other games as well that this comes from and is woven with. So Duarkin existed among many other sports played by indigenous peoples. Now these sports, once again, we're bringing back that indigenous worldview. They were used to nurture indigenous peoples as individuals and also their community. So it wasn't just reconciliation. So now I'm kind of expanding on this idea that I kept on hearing of this game was medicine. So these sports, specifically these games and these sports, were used to help bring individuals into balance. And what they would do is they would kind of provide that physical training, but also touch on other aspects of health. And a really, personally, a really funny game that I found was one that is very old. It's called the Run and Scream. And it's a great example of a game that indigenous kids played specifically. And what it looks like, and maybe some of you have played this in elementary, I did. I had no idea it was indigenous, but the kids would take turns all kind of running and yelling at the same time to see how far they could run before they needed to breathe. And then they would mark where they needed to breathe, and then they would try to beat it again. And what this did was it really developed lung capacity, it developed endurance, it really helped with that overall physical health. But it also is really hilarious to watch and to take part in. And it had a very positive effect on that mental and emotional health and well-being. So another aspect that I wanted to bring up with indigenous sports specifically is that they were used to bring communities together. So those familiar with lacrosse would know that it has indigenous origins as well. And it had many different names. In the Algonquian language, it was known as Bagatoe. And it also had many other names as well, some that I cannot pronounce. But you can see here a picture of indigenous peoples playing that. Now, what I loved about this is that historians are saying that these games were actually events, kind of like they are today. And what they say and what they estimate is that anywhere from 100 to 100,000 players would be playing a game at any given point. That's how large they would get. So what we're seeing is that these games also served as probably one of those tools by which communities kind of renewed that relationship and celebrated that relationship that they had with each other. And what I'm also finding as well is that these games often had a very spiritual element to their core. One thing I kept on finding again and again with lacrosse specifically was that it was translated directly into being the creator's game, and that it really did have that idea of sacredness embedded in it, which I could start seeing like, oh my gosh, yeah, this makes sense. This is why it was seen as medicine, because it brought people and communities back into balance in terms of their physical health, their emotional health, their mental health, and their spiritual health as well. So now that we've kind of explored an indigenous worldview and also the indigenous origins of hockey and also looking at that in the larger context of indigenous sports, let's return to the original question that we started this session off with, which is, how can we end racism in hockey? So given what we know now, perhaps we may be asking the wrong question. If we know that communities fall in and out of relationship, and that was understood by indigenous communities, which is why they had those treaty processes, these games, these tools to help them bring themselves back into balance. And if they knew that that was a core part of relationships, that it was a process, it was relationship-ing. So if we take into account that hockey was a tool that was used to bring communities back together, through Dwarken, through other later manifestations of that game, to renew that relationship that existed, what does that open up? And what I think that this opens up is sort of a better question. One that's a little bit more generous and kind of takes the heat off of us, I feel like, and channels it towards a productive conversation, which is how can we use hockey to end racism? And with this new language and this new story that we're starting to tell and acknowledge, rather, maybe it's an older story of hockey, we can see really that it is a tool. That this tool can be used to bring ourselves as individuals and also as communities back into balance. And that this really is a potential solution to racism rather than the cause of it or something that is continually perpetuating it. And I think that that's pretty interesting. That does really open up a lot for us. I mean, like, I'm also saying that there are definitely some systemic issues, but once again, we can kind of trim that from the tool and we can use it to once again address what we're trying to achieve, kind of like how hockey has always been used to kind of bring communities together. And then we can also see that the origins of hockey stem from the creation of relationships. So that a major reason of the game evolving into the sport and it having that popularity that we know today was a result of there being many different communities interacting with each other and evolving the game over time. And I think that's important because then everyone today can feel connected to that longer story that we're a part of, which at its core was based off of inclusion and diversity. And then lastly, if we know this about hockey, we can align ourselves with the story that we're still a part of. And hockey then becomes a practice by which we can end racism. It's not a barrier or cause of it, and that we're also acknowledging that we will come out of balance and that we're not perfect. So rather than this from a punitive place, we can start really asking ourselves, what are the processes and questions that we need to be asking to remind ourselves of this story? So what I'd like to do, and I see that we have a question in the chat, so thank you so much, is, and I will get to that, is I'd like to spend some time right now just reflecting on the ways in which we can start incorporating these ideas. And I know we probably won't have time to have a full discussion or anything like that, but I just wanted to give some prompts out there that perhaps we can just start thinking about and having roll around in our heads. We probably won't come up with a final solution to this problem, but we can start thinking about it. And sometimes I think that asking questions can be just as valuable as giving answers. So what I thought would be useful would be thinking about the questions of what are the ways that we can use our sport to recognize and celebrate the diversity of the communities who play? The second question that I have for you all to think about is, what are the ways in which we can create new relationships with players, with teams, with other communities? And what are the ways in which we can regularly explore the roots of our game, really celebrate where we come from, so that we remember that story that we're a part of? So I'll give you all perhaps 2 minutes to start thinking of some answers, or even thinking of better questions. If you want to type in whatever you're saying or thinking about rather in the chat, feel free to do so. I can share some thoughts, but I'll give you all like around 2 minutes and then we'll wrap up. Great. So we'll move on to the last little part that I was hoping to have, which is a closing circle where we can kind of have some space to share our thoughts, some of the questions and things that we came up with from those questions. I know that we have one comment here, which is, how do we get this important knowledge about the history of hockey to the wider community? What can we do as a grassroots organization to show how hockey has evolved out of the Indigenous community? Yeah, so I think that actually someone just maybe provided a solution. So for me, I definitely don't have the answers here, but I think that we're in a really interesting place to start exploring. I mean, definitely conversations and conferences like this provide a really lovely opportunity to discuss this. There are a lot of documentaries that are being released specifically about this concept, but I think the more that we can look at hockey perhaps from this perspective of it is the result of a lot of wonderful people and communities building to it, I think that that kind of opens up a lot of opportunities to start kind of having more conversations. So it doesn't really directly answer that. And then Chelsea said that I'm a junior high teacher, and I think passing this knowledge out to phys ed and social studies teachers could be incredible. I truly don't know how much this knowledge is known by my colleagues. You know, this was a lot of new information for me. So I definitely think that there's a lot of work that we can do in terms of sharing this information of perhaps incorporating it into the curriculum, but also something to be proud of as well. Like I really find that. So, and then we're also, I thought that minor hockey could start wearing patches similar to stop patches. Yeah, they could start wearing patches that kind of perhaps connect it back to this larger story that we're a part of. Maybe that's something that we can be doing in terms of the physical space. What is it that we have that we could be using to help remind us of this story? I think that that's great. Yeah, incorporating it into jerseys. I think that the more that we look towards answers that are based off of everything that we have available to us, that is sustainable as well, because we won't solve racism in like a couple of years or even maybe our lifetime, but we can definitely take some meaningful steps towards that, and we need to be able to to do that. Yeah, I will definitely email you as well. And we're also hearing some other thoughts about social media platforms. And then Sanjeev says, how would we be able to connect with you? Oh, yes. Okay. Great. So what I'll do is I'm going to put in the chat my email, and you can reach me there if you have any other questions. Also, our website is here, so you can also get a sense of more of the work that we do. Yeah, and if there are any other thoughts, I'll kind of just leave this open until 12. Or rather 2, you can see I need more coffee. Yeah, feel free to reach out or continue to start throwing in ideas. We're hearing a lot of things about social media, about what are the physical reminders that we can have. There's some really great museums that could be visited once we're allowed to travel out on the East Coast. Yeah, no worries. Thank you everyone so much for sharing your time.